This developing one out of the United States after U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi essentially disinvited President Trump from giving his upcoming State of the Union address at the end of January. Donald Trump has responded, and it's getting a little ugly, telling the Speaker herself to postpone her own upcoming travel plans. Listen to this. In a letter sent to Nancy Pelosi, Donald Trump tells her that he is canceling her use of a military aircraft for a planned 7-day overseas trip that she was to take to Brussels, Belgium, then on to Egypt and Afghanistan. Donald Trump says all because of the ongoing partial government shutdown. Trump writes, "I'm sure you would agree that canceling this public relations event is appropriate." He says it would be better if she remained in Washington to negotiate the end to the ongoing shutdown, which, by the way, if you're keeping track, is now in day 27. That's right, the longest in U.S. history. Let's bring in Brian Calfano, political scientist, journalism professor at the University of Cincinnati in Ohio. Today, though, we find him in good old Dallas, Texas. What do you make of Donald Trump's pushback here, Brian?
Oh, Todd, first of all, good to see you. Happy New Year. And unfortunately for American politics, Trump's response is something that I don't think anybody's surprised by. This is a political food fight now. At least it's devolved into that between the administration and Nancy Pelosi and to a certain extent, Chuck Schumer. And I think you've seen that now with the president calling Pelosi's planned trip to those countries a PR event. It's really not that. You want to make sure that your elected officials and your leadership, whether it be in the executive or legislative branches, has some sense of what's going on the ground. Congress is in charge of spending money, or at least appropriating the funds that the president uses to carry out American foreign policy. So to go on some kind of fact-finding mission or to get a sense of what's happening on the ground in those countries is very important for Speaker Pelosi. It's not a PR stunt, but I don't know that it's maybe something she was surprised by to see the president push back and say, yeah, you probably ought not go, because we still have to negotiate a way to end this shutdown.
As I was beginning the story and I was reading out what's going on between these two, I could see you out of the corner of my eye kind of shaking your head and smiling as I was itemizing this, as you're calling it, political food fight. So let me ask you, because it gets a little confusing, Brian, even for those of us who try to keep up every day, almost every minute with the latest developments. Does this mean that Donald Trump will not be giving his State of the Union address at the end of January, or do we know?
We don't have official word on that. The Constitution provides an expectation that the president will, from time to time, give a regular update on the State of the Union. It doesn't specify that it has to be in the House chamber with both of the chambers present, the House and the Senate. It obviously didn't specify it had to be on television. Television didn't exist at that time. And it doesn't specify that it has to be in January or even every year. And so this is the sort of thing that I think we should probably wait and see if cooler heads prevail. But this is also Donald Trump, and I would imagine he has a vested interest in trying to get as much airtime as he possibly can. And even though he does not control the calendar for the House and the House chamber, the physical chamber, it would be highly unusual for the entire Congress to essentially ignore the President of the United States driving over to the Capitol building to give some kind of address or to meet with folks. If nothing else, I think you'll see Republicans at least seated for the presidential address. And that's where it could get really interesting. If it is indeed next Tuesday that President Trump wishes to give the State of the Union address, as he previously indicated, you may see for the first time in history only Republicans seated, at least among House members, because I'm sure the Democratic caucus wishes to stand behind Speaker Pelosi as strongly as possible.
And speaking of Pelosi and this overseas trip, which now may or may not be canceled, again, this is sort of another unknown. We don't know what's going to happen. Trump saying you're not going to get the use of that military aircraft. So I don't know if that means she'll try to find other means or if this is a bluff. But should she be leaving the Capitol in the midst of this shutdown, day 27? Should she be going on a 7-day overseas trip amid all of this?
Should is an interesting way to put that. I mean, if you're looking at this and trying to be a responsible adult and the person who is second in line for the presidency, you'd wonder if Pelosi really has lost some of her marbles here in terms of having this trip set. Now, of course, it was a secret trip until the president spilled the beans about it, and it was scheduled far in advance. And so whether or not she intended to actually follow through on that trip remains to be seen. But of course, now the president has pulled the plug, at least on the military transport for her. But I would say, look, no, this is something that you would expect the president not to go off golfing during this sort of thing either. And if Pelosi wanted to take this trip, she could have certainly worked around the schedule that we've sort of found ourselves in, which is essentially everybody sitting around in Washington, D.C., but nobody doing any real work and doing any talking about getting us through this crisis. So I don't think she should be going anywhere. And obviously now she won't be. I think it's probably an impossibility for her to do this on a private way in any kind of private means. So she shouldn't be going, and obviously she won't be.
Can I ask you, if you were a gambling man, how long you think this shutdown is going to go on?
Oh, geez. Well, to be honest with you, I think not as long as you might think. If the macroeconomic indicators show that there is an economic slowdown, and if there are enough folks in the president's political base who are starting to take a U-turn away from him in, say, the Rasmussen poll, which tends to be very favorable to the president, if those indicators start going south, so to speak, I think the president is going to face extreme pressure to move back to some kind of negotiating position that has any serious sense of working out. And I think both of those possibilities, an economic slowdown and an erosion of support among his core supporters, is highly likely. This shutdown is helping no one. In fact, an argument can be made that it's hurting some of his strongest supporters the most, especially those living in the Mountain West who rely on the federal government to keeping its fisheries and parks and other types of outdoor properties open to keep the economic engine of that region of the country moving ahead. And it's disproportionately falling, therefore, on Trump supporters, this negative effect, I should say, from the shutdown.
Brian Calfano joining us from Dallas, Texas today, political commentator with his take on this shutdown, day 27. Thank you, Brian.
Thanks, Todd.